There's such a big row at the moment about transgender identity, and I wondered what your thoughts were on it from a neuroscience point of view.
It's a question that comes up quite a lot, as you can imagine, and there is a big debate in the transgender community and the feminist community, and a lot of tension around statements being made about, I've got a female brain. I think that Caitlyn Jenner said that, I've always had a female brain in a male body. I mean, I think actually the last, sex redefined could explain a lot of the problems that people have. I mean, if you talk to transgender individuals, very often they say, I feel I've been put in the wrong box or the wrong body. I've always felt like a female and, I've been told I'm a male and I should be brought up, in a particular way. And so they go through long, painful journeys in order to move from one box to the other. Well, my answer to that is maybe let's get rid of the boxes. If we didn't have the boxes, then those kind of tensions may disappear. I mean, I'm not saying they disappear altogether, but I think the whole transgender issue actually brings up, really interesting insights into what's going on.
Thank you. Right, so we have some roving microphones. If you could stick your hands up. I want to start by taking something from the very top, if you've got a question there. So wave your hand, because I've got the lights in my eyes. Right, there's one, typically you're at the other end. There's one right there, but you have been waving very energetically. So we'll take this one first, and then I'll come down, and then we'll move around. If you could keep the questions nice and straightforward so we can get through loads, that would be great.
Hi, so, is that working? I'm a cognitive neuroscientist as well, and I wondered what your thoughts were on Simon Baron-Cohen's work on the autistic male brain, because females have been sort of sidelined within ASD, which was my specialty, and with some of my colleagues, even the vocabulary to use and begin to use, okay, should we say female, should we say male, that already starts us in the wrong foot. So number one, how would you address setting new heuristics for studying something like ASD or a specific disorder, and you're looking at male and female participants? And then two, when can you start debunking Simon Baron-Cohen? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
The language is really important. One of the people whose books I trashed runs a website called Brain Sex. And you can take a test on that website to prove whether your brain is male or female. And when I spoke to her, I said, she said, you don't have to be a man to have a male brain. So I said, so why do you call it a male brain? And I think language is really important, and I think that's an aspect of it, if that's an answer to your first question. I mean, Samira said, my kind of day job is neuroimaging and autism. And the whole underrepresentation of girls in autism is really important. And in a way, it encapsulates the same ideas, because people always thought, so autism is a male disorder. So surprisingly, there's more and more males diagnosed as autistic, because that's what people expect. If a child has behavioural problems, it's much more likely if they're a boy that they'll be identified as autistic than if they're a girl. And if you talk to the families of girls with autism, it's been a big, big struggle to get them identified as having this particular problem. So I think the language is really important. Second issue, I did have a debate with Simon Baron-Cohen, actually, about men and women, not autism, in the summer. And I did my little rant about, the 18th century and why are we still asking these questions. And he charmingly started his response by saying, I agree with Gina, which was a bit alarming for the person sharing it, because he was hoping we were going to be at each other's throats. I think if you're going to be getting away from the language, so if you're interested in systemizing and empathizing, then that's what you're talking about. You shouldn't be talking about extreme male brain. And I think a lot of the work that he's done, particularly the idea that, from a very early age, boys showed preferences for particular objects, whereas girls preferred the mother's face, etc., has not been replicated. So I think a lot of the work early on which his theories are based hasn't been replicated.
Thank you. Right, let's do questions
talk
down
afterwards.
Here. Thank you. There's one right at the back there. And then where's our other microphone? Is it on this side? Is there a question this side? I'll line it up. Right, there's one in the third row, 4 people in. Thank you. We'll take that one next. Go ahead if you've got the mic.
Hi. Statistically, they say that females get better grades at GCSEs and A-levels. And especially when I was at college and doing my GCSEs, we were told this was because we do more coursework which is more suitable to girls than to boys. Do you think that this is harmful to be told as a female that? And is there any proof in it or truth in it?
I think the stereotype threat in brain material demonstrates that anything negative can have a negative impact on your performance and on your brain, and the two are obviously linked. It's really interesting when the whole load of other statistics about an uneven playing field. If boys get things wrong, it's because they haven't worked hard enough. If they get it right, it's because they're actually, a bit of this raw innate ability. If girls get things right, it's because they've worked hard. So we've still got this dispute that, girls do better because they work harder, not because actually, they've got, more of the necessary raw innate talent. So I think, that would be an aspect of it. I don't know the statistics sufficiently, but, how big is your effect size? It would be interesting to look at that.
There's another question over here.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the interaction between hormones and the effect on the brain, because obviously that is an obvious difference going on in the system. So I just wondered what your thoughts on that were.
I didn't talk much about hormones because I think focusing on the brain structures and functions is enough. Wonderful book by Rebecca Jordan-Young called Brainstorm, which looks in the same sort of way at the kind of research that's been done on hormones, assumptions that are made, lots of the early work in the 20th century that I mentioned very briefly, done on animals, and an assumption that, because you can manipulate hormone levels in a way that you can't necessarily in humans. And so big assumptions being made there about, generalizing from animal work to human work. There's no good evidence. They've looked quite a lot at whether hormones affect different brain structures. So they've looked at hormone levels and brain development. Clearly, there are different receptors in the brain. I mean, when I say there's no differences between men and women, of course, and I don't need the JPEG sent to me to know, there are differences between men and women, which is related to their reproductive roles. And obviously you can't ignore those. And the hormones are very much related to that. But there's a feeling that this kind of hormone organizational aspect, so that the tram lines are actually determined also by hormone levels, has been pretty well debunked.
Thank you. Let's take one from the very top again. Right, you've got one right there. Lovely. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very entertaining, and I especially liked that you opened with Harry Enfield. But I was wondering if you'd heard, it's been in the media, I think it's just today, that women are paying more at the counter for similar objects as men. And I was wondering if you thought that was down to possibly that personal finance should be added to the list of difficult subjects, or...
Sorry, women are paying more?
Yeah, they're paying more at the till for similar things as men.
Things like razors and things.
Oh, okay.
Just the women's
version. They're not deliberately handing over more money.
I hit a joke
they're being
in that
charged
question.
more, yeah. I was a bit puzzled there. So they're being charged more. Sorry, yes. And what?
Well, I was wondering if you'd heard about this, if you'd also heard it, but...
Well, I think the whole... an aspect of that is marketing. I mean, I came across this book written by, I'm afraid, a couple of psychologists called Inside Her Pretty Little Head. And it was explicitly explaining to marketers, trainee marketers or whatever, how to really focus on, and emphasize this difference. This was, in particular, I can't remember the particular organizations. So maybe part of that, if you can dress something up in a slightly different way.
Like a pink razor rather than a blue one.
The
Women
razor,
have extra sensitive skin, which needs extra specially expensive
Okay,
razor blades
yeah.
or something.
How big
Is this
is
not
your
true?
how big is your effect size? I think I'd be interested with respect to sensitive skin. I mean, I presume the charging differences is yes. I mean, I think that's an outcome and another indication of marketing is another whole rant I could do about, particularly with toys, and early on. And I think that's why I think this is important, because I think the whole kind of stereotype thing is much more in your face than it used to be. I really believe that that there's much more, and particularly around adolescence. And it's really fascinating that a time in life when their brains are really, really plastic, they're being bombarded with these really strong messages about differences between boys and girls.
Thanks.
Thank you. Right. Take the person at the end of the aisle here next. And then was there other microphone? Is it around here? Right, do we have a question? Right, they take these two on the end. Yes,
thank
you
you.
did. Sorry.
Thank you for your talk. Quick comments. I'm not a geneticist, but I imagine there may be some who'd object to being categorised as only working in dichotomies and not dimensions. But anyway, don't really know. Wanted to ask about the expression of fear in men and women. When surveys are done asking people what they're afraid of, different types of objects and situations, females always express more fear than males, and it seems to be the case, whatever the educational level, culture, or age to some degree. And I wondered what your thoughts were about the reasons for this. I mean, you could argue that evolutionarily speaking, there are good reasons for the testosterone and aggression in males, because they've got more chance to get away with it and bigger and so on. If you're female, you might do better to guard the young and hang back. On the other hand, you might say that from day one, little boys are encouraged to be active and little girls are pacified and so on. I just wondered what your thoughts were.
Gina.
Certainly, I think the issue about expression of fear and behaviour, and we're talking this afternoon coincidentally about men and crying, and you know the statistics are quite a big effect size with respect to men crying, women crying. Interestingly, I noticed last week, you know, the pictures of Obama crying. Didn't seem to be much derogatory comments associated with that. You know, which might have been different if perhaps Hillary Clinton had been president and was seen crying. Who knows? Speculation. But I think there is a clear expression of fear. Is certainly something which, from a very early age, I think it's shown that the whole concept of being a crybaby is something which is directed at boys. Difficult to entangle. The evolutionary argument is interesting, and very often. The other person in the debate with Simon Baron-Cohen was Helena Cronin, who has very strong views about the evolutionary reason for differences between men and women. This is where I think this plasticity work comes in. I mean, evolution, thousands of years ago, I mean, if we can now show that our brains can change within weeks because of particular experiences, I think harking back to evolutionary arguments and picking pink berries or fighting saber-toothed tigers is probably really a lost cause. So I think the whole fear thing, we're entangled. I don't know. I don't think there's any evidence of massive differences in emotion regulation between males and females. Maybe an overlapping, but small effect size.
I was wondering how many women only learnt that they were supposed to be afraid of mice from watching that woman in the Tom and Jerry cartoons.
Don't know.
Right, one here.
Yeah. Thank you. Two things sort of struck me. The first was that I gather that there's a worse or a bigger problem in Britain and other northwestern European countries with girls in STEM, and I wondered if you'd had an opportunity to consider what's going wrong in this country in terms of between, time a girl's born by the time she's 18, why there's literally no women doing computer science. And the second one was that, you've probably been in the business for a while, and I wondered if you were, not a very long time, obviously, but if you were surprised at the incredible reluctance to surrender the idea that men aren't necessarily naturally better at maths. It seems, is it just sort of resistance to feminism or sexism, or is it there's something so fundamental about women's skill set? I mean, are you surprised by that, basically?
Yeah. Thank you. The first question, yes, I think it's appalling. Sarah Jane Blakemore's done some really nice work on the adolescent brain. So you've got this brain which is not very well wired to resist peer pressure, all sorts of changes in the emotion regulation system, which means they're much more vulnerable to stereotype threat. Age about 14, what do? We get them to make life-changing decisions about what subjects they should do. So anybody here has got the ear of the education minister, just stop, look at what you're doing and saying, don't make people make really important decisions when their brain is in that state. So I think that's important. I've lost track of the second question. It was the whole...
Are you surprised by the degree of resistance to
Yeah, I'm surprised, well, perhaps not, but I'm surprised by the degree of resistance to anything where you suggest that there aren't fixed male-female differences. I think the whole idea of maths, stereotype threat and maths anxiety, which is a kind of very specific type of stereotype threat, emerges very early. I mean, the study I mentioned very briefly was done on 9-year-old girls who were already saying, I'm a girl, I can't do maths. And then
the Western society aspect of it too, which you raised, I thought
yes,
was interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think, interestingly, in Iran, it's a different, surprising, perhaps given the culture, much more likely that women do maths. And Mariam Mazakani, who won the Fields Medal 2 years ago now, is Iranian. I mean, she moved to California, etc. But again, it's a bit like, if these things are fixed, how come they're different in different cultures? So I am surprised. But then again, people were saying, no, girls don't choose to do maths. But I don't think that's a biological aspect.
Just thinking I shouldn't say it, but in Iran, you know, it's got the highest divorce rate initiated by women.
Just interesting correlation.
Yeah,
right?
I thought I
maths.
should mention it, but it's a fact. I found it when I went. We had another question just behind. Go for it.
Yeah, I wanted to make a brief point and then ask a question. And the first was just that I would query the inclusion of Tim Hunt in that gallery of baddies. I think that's rather unfair given the context of his remarks that later came out. The second thing I wanted to ask was whether, I mean, it seems that there's a lot of additional useful information that is not reported or noticed with neurological studies on women and men, and that the Mail article there being a good example, where there's a lot of data that doesn't fit the thesis that isn't necessarily included or given as much prominence. But I also wonder if it's potentially also dogmatic to conclude that there are no differences between men and women, or whether one should report all the data and keep an open mind.
Yeah, okay. Tim Hunt, yes, apologies, it was a cheap shot. But I think, in a way...
It's still controversial, though.
It's
still
controversial.
in dispute.
And if you're talking about a toxic environment, the comment, whether a joke or not, and I'm not commenting on how he should or shouldn't have been dealt with afterwards, clearly struck a nerve and resulted in a lot of discussion, not all of which was positive with respect to women in science. So, you know, an unfortunate comment and maybe an even more unfortunate outcome. But, you know, that was my reason for including it. And also allowed me to put the tears on the brain at the other side. So apologies, cheap shot. Sorry, I've lost track of it. What was
It was about having an open mind, even if the differences, some of the data shows are very small.
I mean, I think one of the things that, as people may know, there's a big issue at the moment about replicability and kind of famous studies. People say we've done them quite a lot, and they don't really work out in the way we thought. I mean, but even when you do, like that Shaywitz one I mentioned, keeps getting mentioned. The idea is a bit like clinical trials. Maybe you should, before you actually do the study, you publish your protocol. This is what we're going to look at. These are our hypotheses. These are how we're going to analyze the data. And if it's all good science, then it gets published, which means that even the negative findings get published, so that, because there is this publication bias, you know, why are people still asking these questions? It's something that's going to get published. If you find a difference, it's more likely to get published than if you don't. I mean, the papers I'm criticizing, to some extent, you know, a tiny tip of the iceberg. Huge numbers of papers which aren't getting published because they're not finding differences. And you think, we're looking at male-female differences. If this was a clinical trial on a drug and 10% of the people who were tested, there was a difference, but 90% there wasn't, you wouldn't agree to that drug being marketed and saying, oh yeah, there's definitely worth it working here. But that's exactly what's happening in these kind of studies. The ones that do find a difference get published. So people like, you know, the hapless neurotrash, not deliberately, but hapless neurotrash authors will go to the abstracts, the journals, and look at all these papers that have been published. But of course, they won't see all the ones that haven't been published. But I think showing all the data would be really important, really change the whole scenario of what we're finding.
Rivi, to follow up on an earlier question about why STEM subjects are still such a problem for take-up at higher levels, what's your view, if I may ask, on psychology as a school subject? Because it's very controversial, I know,
Yeah.
as being a parent.
Yes, I mean, there's all sorts of things behind that. I mean, I don't know if anybody is doing or has got family doing psychology. I think the GCSE and A-level psychology is a real travesty. And I think if you took, for me, the most boring bits of psychology and forced them on a person, whose brain is not wired properly. So I don't actually think at that level psychology is very good. One of the things that psychology claims to do, and we really try, and I teach in a psychology department, is critical analysis, is actually challenging what's out there, saying, how big is your effect? Is that really the case? Just because it's published, does that mean it's true? Has somebody replicated it? It's really something that psychology, which bizarrely, given its current controversy, really tries to get students to do. So I think...
Because you said that basically there's no brain science in the A-level.
Certainly in some of the A-level syllabuses, the brain science bit is an option. Because quite often, it may be changing a bit, quite a lot of psychology teachers didn't actually do psychology first time round, so they might not feel comfortable with doing the brain science. Although interesting, when I go into schools, that's the bit that the students find interesting. But it is quite complicated, and sometimes it gets dropped, because the teacher doesn't feel competent, or they feel the students will find it too hard. So an awareness that psychology is to do with the brain. I mean, I think it should be... I call myself a cognitive neuroscientist now, and it should be part of psychology, but it isn't always. And I know psychology calls itself a science, but I think it's got quite a long way to go to really demonstrate that and to make it useful.
Thank you. Right, so, God, so many questions. Right, I've really got a short amount of time, so we're going to try and whack through them. So let's take these couple here, the two in the middle, and then, I'm trying to see how many we've got time for. We might take that lady down the end as well up there, but yeah, go for it. Who's got the mic? Hello. Yes.
The two key questions that I wanted to ask to the speaker, the first one was, when it comes to selection, say, for example, in leadership roles, what do you think can be done so as to level the playing field so that more women, for example, you gave the example of John, how do you bring more female leaders into the podium so that people can see them? And the second one is to the moderator, and that is the role of the media in the different portrayals.
That's a whole other talk. I'll come back sometime. Or drop me an email, but I think Gina should answer the first one.
And the last one is, I wanted to ask what you think about the idea of mentorship. So I work as a surgeon, and my mentor's a male. How do you, the role of mentorship in encouraging mentorship to bring women into fields?
Okay, brilliant. One thing I didn't show in this talk, but did show in the talk I summarised into a single slide, is the amazing effect of what we call empowerment on stereotype threat. So that if you actually give girls, you sort of prime girls by saying, before you do this task, can you just tell me a story about when you did something really well, or when you were in charge of something and it worked really well? Or even more subtle, you get them, pretend you're CEO of a company and here's a list of all your employees, put them in order of importance, etc. So it's a kind of empowerment priming. And that's been found, to overcome the effects of stereotype threat, so they don't show the kind of negative impact of if you then put them in a stereotype threat situation. But also, interestingly, of course, it changes the brain. So maybe a lot more work on empowering people, making them feel they get things right is important. And the mentorship is really role models. Again, this is a social psychology experiment. I don't think it's been done on the brain, but they've actually looked at the effect of virtual reality environment of getting girls and boys, but the girls in particular, who are nervous to give public speaking talks, so that they were then rated on the content and the confidence with which they dealt with the answers and how long they spoke for. And they found that if in the back of the room there was pictures of powerful female role models, they did a lot better. And this was Angela Merkel and Hillary Clinton, in fact, a study done in the States. So very subtle changes can actually change the behaviour in quite an interesting way. So I think mentors, role models, and just making this sort of information available to people, saying, your brain is plastic. It can do almost anything.
Excellent. You've got another one right there, haven't you? Yes.
Hi, thank you so much. Just the first question was about pain regulation between males and females, and I keep hearing different things that women are more kind of in a sensory way, more sensitive, or they have higher pain thresholds.
Yeah.
Is there really any evidence to back any of this up?
It's a good question, and pain regulation is something which is coming out a lot. Is people are still studying. Again, you think, why we look at males and females? If you're interested in pain regulation, why don't you look at individuals? If you want to understand pain regulation, people who suffer pain more or people who suffer pain less, but whatever. The male-female dimension goes in there. It's very confusing, the literature. If you start to look into it, in some cases women have higher pain thresholds, some cases men have higher pain thresholds. Sometimes it depends on the pain. Sometimes, different genders can cope with pain for longer periods of time. So short answer is I don't know. I know it's an area which people are really saying there's a difference between males and females.
But it sounds like it's a lot of what you've been saying, that it's not gender
It could
specific.
be. I mean, I wouldn't, I couldn't give a definite answer. I know it's something people are interested in, but it may well be useful to use those kind of filters to see what's going on.
The second question isn't quite, it is very brief. It's not quite gender-based, but it's more about different cultures. What you're saying here, can it be moved laterally across to, rather than looking at the biological differences within cultures, is it both biological and sociological, or is it purely sociological?
Yeah, I mean, given the topic of the talk, it was obviously gender-based, but anywhere where there are minority groups who appear to have difficulties for whatever reasons, you can actually have a look and see the environment they're brought up in, the expectations. I mean, we talk a lot about, girls into STEM subject. What about boys into biology? The statistics we were showing there demonstrates that that's an issue there. So clearly I've been talking about the effect on girls, which I think is really important, but similarly there are effects on boys and ethnic minorities, different cultures who have different expectations of women, etc.
Thank you so much. I wish we had time for more questions, but I know one of the messages I'm taking away is just what kind of questions do people ask in their research, which reveals so much about underlying biases. So thank you for that. Thank you for terrific questions.
Yeah,
and thanks for a wonderful evening.